The man standing at the microphone had just won his third Formula One World Championship. He had done it at Suzuka, Japan, in 1991, on a circuit that had already taken everything from him once before. He was 31 years old. He was the fastest racing driver on the planet. And when the press conference ended and the cameras were finally turned off, Ayrton Senna da Silva looked at the ceiling for a long moment, exhaled slowly, and said something that nobody in the room had expected to hear. He said, "I have spent my entire career in a sport that did not want me here, and I have spent my entire career proving them wrong." Nobody wrote that down. Nobody recorded it on tape. But the people in that room remembered it for the rest of their lives, because they understood what he meant, and because they had seen exactly how true it was. If you are watching this channel for the first time, and you want to understand what it meant to be Ayrton Senna in Europe, then stay until the end of this video. Because this is not a story about lap times. This is a story about what it costs a man to walk into a room where the walls were built before he was born, and to refuse, with every cell of his body, to leave. It began not in a paddock, not in a press conference, not in the aftermath of some political scandal. It began in a two-bedroom bungalow on Rouge Drive in Norwich, England, in 1981. Ayrton was 21 years old. He had come from Sao Paulo, from a wealthy family, from a climate that was never gray, to compete in Formula Ford 1600 at the Snetterton circuit 35 kilometers away. He arrived with his young wife Liliane, and with almost nothing else. His father, Milton da Silva, had been reluctant to finance what he called a flight of fancy, and so the young Brazilian and his wife adopted a modest existence in one of the quietest cities in eastern England, far from anything that resembled the life they had known. Tom Rubython, who later wrote what became the definitive biography of Senna, described the Norwich years as the most important period of Senna's life. "Make or break," he said. Because what happened there was not just racing. What happened there was a young South American man arriving into a world that had its own codes, its own hierarchies, its own unspoken agreements about who belonged and who did not. European junior racing in the early 1980s was a closed ecosystem. Teams preferred drivers from their own countries. Sponsors preferred drivers from markets that mattered to them financially. And the Paddock, that self-contained world behind the barriers, had a very particular way of looking at outsiders. Senna was an outsider. He was Brazilian. He was brown-skinned. He spoke English with a heavy accent. And he was, from his very first appearance in a racing car on English soil, undeniably, incomprehensibly fast. In 3 years of junior racing in Britain, he won 48 races out of 67. He won the Formula Ford 1600 British Championship in 1981. He won the Formula Ford 2000 European Championship in 1982. He won the British Formula 3 Championship in 1983, beating a field that included Martin Brundle, in a title fight so intense it is still discussed by people who were there. And at Macau that same year, he won the Grand Prix that served as the unofficial showcase for drivers ready to make the step to Formula One. He had won 5 championships in 5 seasons, every championship available to him, and the response from the teams at the top of the sport was, in several cases, silence. Lotus had a vacancy, but its title sponsor, John Player and Sons, wanted British drivers. Brabham had a vacancy, but its title sponsor, Parmalat, wanted drivers from their home country. And then there was Brabham's lead driver, Nelson Piquet, who, according to multiple accounts, actively vetoed Senna from joining the team. Piquet was Brazilian himself. He was also a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that in the economics of European motorsport, there was only room for one Brazilian at the top. He arranged for the team to sign a different driver instead. Williams had no vacancy. McLaren had no vacancy. And so the man who had won 5 consecutive championships in British and European junior racing signed with Toleman, a team running less competitive Pirelli tires, and an engine that had a history of reliability problems. This is the context. This is what the Paddock looked like in 1984, when Ayrton Senna made his Formula One debut at the Brazilian Grand Prix in Rio de Janeiro, qualifying 17th of 26. This is what the walls looked like before he started taking them apart. The wall came down for the first time on the 27th of May, 1984, Monaco. It was raining. It had been raining for hours, and the streets of Monte Carlo were rivers of standing water, and visibility was close to nothing. Senna had qualified 13th. Alain Prost, already a world champion, was in the McLaren MP42, a machine that was in an entirely different category from the Toleman Hart that Senna was driving. In terms of engine power, in terms of aerodynamics, in terms of resources and preparation, there was no comparison. And Senna passed him. He passed 14 cars on a circuit where overtaking in dry conditions is considered nearly impossible. He was catching Prost at the rate of 3 seconds per lap. And then the race was stopped. The red flag came out on lap 31. The race was declared finished. Prost was declared the winner. And even today, 40 years later, surviving members of the Toleman team use the word robbed when they talk about that afternoon. What happened at Monaco in 1984 was not an accident. The race director was Jackie Ickx, a Belgian driver who was at that time contracted to Porsche, the company that manufactured the engine in Prost's McLaren. After the race, Ickx himself, in a private conversation with Brazilian journalist Reginaldo Leme, admitted that he had been pressured by Jean-Marie Balestre, the president of FISA, the governing body of Formula One, to stop the race. Balestre, who was French, who had been in position of power in European motorsport since 1978, who had built his authority on relationships with European teams and European drivers, saw the race being stopped and called it a safety decision. 40 years later, the debate has never truly ended. What the Paddock knew, and what many in the media understood but few were willing to print, was that a young Brazilian in a small car had been about to beat the establishment's chosen champion on the most symbolic circuit in the world. And that was a problem. Senna did not speak publicly about it in those terms. Not then. He was 24 years old. He was a rookie. He had no power, no leverage, no seat secured for the following year. He drove the rest of the 1984 season in the Toleman, finishing third in Britain and third in Portugal, quietly building what he was building. And at the end of the year, he left for Lotus in a manner that cost him a suspension from one race for being in breach of his Toleman contract. Even that, the punishment for daring to move forward, was delivered by people who ran the machine he was trying to climb. The years at Lotus, from 1985 to 1987, were the years where Senna built the infrastructure of his legacy. He won his first race in Portugal in 1985, in the rain. He won in Detroit. He won at Jerez in Spain in 1986, in a battle so close that the margin of victory over Mansell was 0.014 seconds, the closest finish in Formula One history at the time. He was doing something that no driver from outside the traditional European or South American establishment had done in the modern era of the sport. He was not just competing, he was winning, regularly, undeniably, in conditions, particularly in the rain, where the data said his cars were not supposed to be in the positions he was putting them. And then came 1988. McLaren, Honda, Alain Prost as his teammate, and the beginning of the conflict that would define not just Senna's career, but the entire political architecture of Formula One for the next 5 years. Prost, when asked by McLaren boss Ron Dennis for his opinion on which Brazilian to sign, had chosen Senna over Piquet. He came to regret the decision almost immediately, because in 1988, Senna won 8 of 16 races, Prost won 7, McLaren won 15 of 16 Grand Prix, and at the end of the year, by 3 points, Senna was world champion for the first time. Prost, the man who had won 2 championships already, the man the French press called the Professor, the man who represented everything that the European establishment of Formula One had built, finished second to the Brazilian from Sao Paulo. What happened next is recorded history. What happened next is also, if you look at it clearly, something darker. At the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka, on the 47th lap, Prost turned into the first chicane and made contact with Senna. Both cars stopped. Prost got out of his McLaren and retired from the race. Senna, with the help of marshals, restarted his car and rejoined the track. He won the race. And then, within minutes of the finish, he was disqualified. Not for the collision, not for dangerous driving, for rejoining the track from the escape road rather than reversing through the chicane in the wrong direction, a maneuver that would have been physically more dangerous than what he had done. The FIA stewards, under pressure that was documented, acknowledged, and later admitted, upheld the disqualification. Prost was declared the 1989 world champion. Senna had been the faster driver. Senna had been the winner on the road. And Senna had been stripped of the title by a decision made by a French governing body president in favor of a French driver. Senna said publicly that political and economic pressure groups had manipulated behind the scenes to affect the result of the championship. Balestre responded by fining him $100,000 and suspending his super license. Not Prost's license, Senna's. Without a super license, a driver cannot compete in Formula One. The man who had just lost the championship on a ruling that even the officials later admitted was influenced by Balestre, was now being told he could not race in the following year unless he apologized and paid the fine. 7 years later, in 1996, Balestre admitted publicly that he had acted to favor Prost, his fellow Frenchman, in the aftermath of the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix. The title had been manipulated. Senna had been right. But in the winter of 1989 and 1990, the admission was still years away, and Senna was facing the very real possibility of being banned from the sport entirely. There is a quote from that winter that circulated in the Paddock. A journalist working for a French publication was overheard in the press room at a pre-season event saying words to this effect: "Senna will never truly be accepted here. He is too emotional, too difficult, too foreign for this sport. Formula One is a European institution. It was built by Europeans for Europeans. He can win races. He cannot change what this sport is." The quote was never published. The man who said it was never named publicly, but it circulated. It reached the ears of people inside the McLaren team. It reached, by the accounts of those who were present, the ears of Senna himself. What Senna did with it is what Senna always did. He did not respond with words. He went to a meeting with the World Motorsports Council in December of 1989, stood in front of the people who had stripped him of a title and were now threatening to take away his right to race, refused to apologize for anything he had said about Balestre, was told that his license would be refused, watched McLaren and Honda negotiate on his behalf, issued a statement that was a withdrawal rather than an apology, and drove at the first race of 1990 in Phoenix, Arizona, on a circuit he had never seen before the week of the Grand Prix, having only been cleared to drive a Formula One car 15 days earlier. He qualified on pole. He won the race. The 1990 season was defined by a crash at the first corner of the Japanese Grand Prix, where Senna, having been placed by Balestre's personal intervention on the dirty side of the grid, despite qualifying on pole position, drove into Prost at 270 kilometers per hour and became world champion in the fire and wreckage. It was brutal. Senna later admitted it was deliberate. He said, "If you get taken advantage of every single time you try to do your job cleanly and properly, by the system, by other people taking advantage of it, what should you do? You may make a mistake, but you should fight." He won the 1990 championship. He won 1991, 3 titles, 65 pole positions, a record that stood for more than a decade. And through all of it, the political machinery of a sport that had been designed without him in mind continued to find ways to remind him where the boundaries were. What Balestre told the crowd at Interlagos in 1990, when the Brazilian fans booed him in the stands after what had happened in Japan the year before, is worth repeating in full. Standing in the paddock in Sao Paulo, Balestre turned toward the noise and said, "This is our championship. If you do not want it, we do not have to give it to you. You need to learn some manners. This is our championship. Those 4 words contain everything you need to understand about what Ayrton Senna was navigating every time he climbed into a racing car in Europe, a sport that considered itself a European institution, a governing body that considered itself the arbiter of who belonged, a paddock that had, for decades, operated on the assumption that the people at the top of it would always look like the people who had built it. Senna did not fit that image. He knew it, and he drove every qualifying session, every wet race, every political fight, like a man who understood that the only argument that could not be dismissed, disqualified, fined, or regulated away was the one written in the results. In a poll of Formula One drivers conducted in 1993, Senna received a near-unanimous vote as the greatest driver in Formula One. Not the fastest, the greatest. That poll was conducted among the men who raced against him, the men who had seen from inside the cockpit what he did in the rain at Donington Park in April of that year, what he did at Monaco 6 times, what he did at Suzuka, at Estoril, at Detroit. Men who spoke French and Italian and German and English. Men who drove for Ferrari and Williams and Benetton and Tyrrell. Men who had grown up inside the European institution that had told him in one way or another that there was a limit to how far a Brazilian could go. And they voted unanimously. When Senna died at Imola on the 1st of May, 1994, the state funeral in Sao Paulo was attended by more than 1 million people. Streets were lined 3 and 4 deep. Grown men who had never met him stood on rooftops to watch the cortege pass. In Brazil, he was not a racing driver. He was not a celebrity. He was proof that the country itself was capable of producing something that the world could not dismiss, could not disqualify, could not regulate away. He had gone to Europe in 1981 with no seat, no contract, no platform, and no guarantee that the sport would ever make room for him. He had won 3 world championships. He had set records that stood for more than a decade. He had been fined, suspended, disqualified, threatened, and politically undermined by the institution he was competing in. And he had won anyway. There is a street in Norwich called Senna Drive. It runs through the quiet residential neighborhood in eastern England, where a 21-year-old Brazilian man lived with his wife in a 2-bedroom bungalow, wondering whether the sport he had crossed the Atlantic for would ever let him in. The street was named after him. The city remembered him. Europe remembered him. The paddock that once questioned whether he would be accepted is now home to a sport in which his name is invoked every time someone talks about what greatness looks like under pressure. Every wet race that is held anywhere in the world carries, somewhere in the commentary, a reference to what Senna did in conditions that broke the models, defied the data, and exceeded what was considered physically possible for a racing car. His 3 world championships are facts. His 65 pole positions are facts. His 41 race victories are facts. But what cannot be measured in any of those numbers is the cost of arriving somewhere that was not built for you, and making it impossible for that place to exist without your name. A Paddock insider once said that Senna would never be accepted in Europe. That man's name has been forgotten. Ayrton Senna's name is on a street in Norfolk. It is on a foundation that has invested $80 million in the lives of Brazilian children. It is in the vocabulary of every driver who has ever been asked what it means to push beyond the limit. The institution did not accept him. The institution was changed by him. And that distinction between being accepted by something and transforming it is the only one that will ever matter.